And now we turn to the function we call context. Context is what surrounds an act or artifact of meaning. Meanings only make sense in terms of the context. First, materialization. What is the manner of their referring? Is the immediate meaning like its referent? Does it point us to its referent? Or does it mean what it does as a matter of abstract conventionality? Next, participation. In what way is the agent of meaning participating in the meaning process? By meanings to themselves, by way of representation, by communicating with others, or by interpretation of a communicated meaning for themselves? Where, practically speaking, then, is the meaning positioned in time and in space? What media does it use? The raw resources pulled from the material world and fashioned into a meaning? Then, how is a meaning associated with others? By juxtaposition? By being within another meaning? Or by being a causal aspect of another meaning? And finally, how are meanings like each other? Historical novels, for instance, a mosque, or apple pies. We call this last aspect of context genre. These, of course, are huge questions. So huge, in fact, that it takes us half a book to explore them in the second volume of our transpositional grammar. And even then, we feel we have barely begun to scratch the surface. To start with materialization, I want to explore three primary ways in which meanings connect to context, three fundamental transpositions. Here, we want to rework and extend some ideas that have a long history in the discipline of semiotics. First, I want you to meet Victoria Welby, a great and sadly neglected founder of semiotics. She just signs herself off with a V in order not to be dismissed for being a woman. The Victoria of her V was because she was named after Queen Victoria. The Queen, in fact, was her godmother, and later the younger Victoria became one of the Queen's lady-in-waiting, and her full name was Lady Victoria Alexandrina Maria Louisa Welby. But that wouldn't do for a book on semiotics. However, just like the great computer scientist Ada Lovelace, the few women who managed to live and document intellectual lives in the recent centuries were mostly able to do so in the leisure of the ruling class. Victoria Welby makes some distinctions that resonate with ours in this grammar. Welby's main concepts are sense, meaning, significance, and intertranslation. Welby's sense is more or less our reference, meaning more or less our agency and structure, significance more or less our context and interest, and intertranslation more or less like our notion of transposition. Welby begins a correspondence with the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. In fact, this correspondence becomes one of the main ways in which this other great semiotician eventually comes to be known more widely. Peirce thought Welby's work was enormously important, and in some key respects he recognized that she had reached the same insights he had. Here's a diagram representing some of Peirce's key ideas. Between the object being represented and its representation, there are three cardinal relations: icon, index, and the symbol. We rename and slightly reframe these as three kinds of materialization likeness: directness and abstraction. By materialization, we mean that meanings are remade via one of these three processes of transposition: likeness, directness, and abstraction. In text, some written words represent sounds like whoosh and bang and such like. Many Unicode characters are pictures of what they are representing, most emojis, for example. These are likenesses. Directness points to things outward from the text in the case of proper nouns, or inwards across a text in the case of pronouns, referring to already mentioned persons and dialectics like the word this. Abstraction is the arbitrary or purely conventional expression of meaning. Ferdinand de Saussure, one of the founders of modern linguistics, says that signifieds have arbitrary and so purely conventional relation to signifiers. Dog only refers to a kind of animal by convention in English, skili by convention in Greek. This is just an abstraction where bark in the sentence, the dog barks, sits in connected contrast to dog. We can afford to stay inside the language system to make sense of this sentence. But he doesn't have a very satisfactory account of words where the meaning depends on things outside of the system. Wolf by likeness, and here by way of directedness, when we say the dog is here. One of the interesting phenomena of the digital age is the increasing use of likenesses in text. One example of this is the reliance of ideographs in text. Here are the very first emojis created by Bruce Perello, a student working on the Plato 4 e-learning system at the University of Illinois in 1972. And here are 176 emojis designed by Shigetaka Kurita and made available on mobile phones by the Japanese telephone company NTT in 1999. Today, there are many more ideographs in Unicode than there are phonemes, and the majority of these are likenesses.
And now to image, because we want to be able to demonstrate parallels in the process of materialization of meaning across the different forms. Here's a realistic image. Its meaning is the similarity with an identified person. This happens to be a self-portrait by the great abstract expressionist artist Lee Krasner, painted in the 1930s. Her person is materialized here in the form of a likeness. And here she is working in her studio 30 years later, where this particular image that she's making now captures certain lines of directness. I'm talking about the photograph at the moment rather than the image on the wall. The movement of her body, the thisness and the here-ness of the artist's body in relation to the size and the shapes that are appearing in the painting. Now here is this painting again in the distance there. It's called Portrait in Green, painted in 1966 in the centre. One of her famously abstract expressionist paintings in a retrospective in a gallery in London of her work. But abstraction seems to demand multimodal explanation, hence the large stretch of writing you can see on the wall on the right, and the photo showing the artist doing this work, the one that we were just looking at. As if the sweep of the arm is an important part of the meaning and the making of the work. Now, abstractions are meanings that are not obvious in the manner that likeness and directness are kind of obvious. They are that by convention, as is the case with the word dog. Or they leave a lot of space for the viewer to interpret the meaning. Or they need some hints that may in fact point the viewer to likeness. If you work hard, you may be able to see a person in the portrait in green, in which case the meaning is in the transposition, in the movement from what is initially an abstraction without conventional likeness to seeing a likeness with the help of the title that's on the wall in the gallery. And another example, object. Here I'm going to take as an example something which has tortured Christian theology for about 2 millennia, the meaning of the Eucharist. This is a picture of John Wycliffe, the 14th century religious reformer. The questions that theologians ask is whether the bread and wine are really the body and blood of Christ. For hundreds of years, Catholics said yes, it was, and this is called transubstantiation. When the priest rings the bell, the bread becomes the body of Christ and the wine becomes the blood. Of course, it's not the same time, place and taste as the moment of crucifixion, but the likeness that has been established in that moment has been materialized. Now, Wycliffe disagreed. He thought that the bread and wine were not really likenesses, that they only pointed to Christ's crucifixion. In other words, they were a form of what we would call directedness. Later on, Protestants were to push this further, and they said that the bread and wine were only symbols. They were just abstractions. Now, these three types of meaning may well be just as meaningful as each other, but the manner of their materialization, the way in which Christ's suffering is represented in the Eucharist, for each kind of supplicant, for each type variant of Christianity, is really quite fundamentally different. And now, a body example. We can create bodily likenesses. Actors do this all the time. Some of our ubiquitous gestures are examples of directedness. Here I am pointing at something, for example, or gesturing to somebody to move on. Other gestures are purely abstract, such as nodding yes or a thumbs up. Here are 3 unnamed Anadiliaqua men photographed with the anthropologist Fred Rose on Groote Island in the Gulf of Carpentaria in northern Australia. Rose was studying Anadiliaqua kin classification, which he soon discovered was incredibly complicated. Here are some of the research results from Rose's collaborations with the Anadiliaqua, having lived with them and worked with them for a number of years, a diagrammatic representation of embodied kin abstractions. Every time one Anadiliaqua person saw another person, they saw a complex world of social relations, far more complex, in fact, than the rule-bound and role-bound relations that are in the scrappy ragbag of friends that each of us has on Facebook. More complex even than the fancy algorithms which sort them for you into your activity streams. And a final example, sounds. Likeness is to imitate a sound or play a recording. Directedness is to heed a siren or respond to an alert on a phone. Abstraction is the feeling of a blues riff or the soundtrack of a scary movie. The reason why we have run through these examples is to show the ways in which in a multimodal grammar we can apply a shared language of materialization. Of course, the process of materialization is different for each form, which is why we have to live our meaning lives multimodally. I want to end now with the question of the meanings made by all sentient creatures. Here is a researcher, Sue Savage-Rumbaugh, working with Kanzi, a bonobo who managed to learn to manipulate abstract symbols to a remarkable degree. Without doubt, all sentient creatures mean with likeness and directedness. But to what extent can they also mean abstractly? Some say this is a special human attribute, and they try to connect this with the arbitrary and conventional signs of meaning that we have in language. But Kanzi managed. Abstractions are meanings that only make sense by conventional agreement. Theorists who focus on language think this is what makes it special and makes us special too. But we don't agree. All materializations of meaning are equally important to our human lives, including likenesses and directedness. And humans are not the only creatures to make meaning. If we can stop privileging language, and if we can stop wanting to disconnect language from its reality, then sentience becomes the most spiritual achievement of nature, not the way we happen to make meaning in our ego-centered species.